This is going to be a short lecture on the material that you find in Chapter 8. So first of all, Section 1 of Chapter 8 is on energy and life, and it starts with a review of autotrophs and heterotrophs. So just as a reminder, organisms like plants that make their own food are called autotrophs, and heterotrophs are organisms like animals that have to get their energy from the foods that they eat or they consume. And so, again, those are heterotrophs versus autotrophs. And again, you can pause this as you're watching this video anytime to take notes if you need to. What is the major part of this section is a discussion on ATP. So, chemical energy is found in a number of different things, but primarily what we're going to focus on is the chemical energy found within ATP. And as you guys know, energy comes in many forms like light, energy, heat energy, electricity, or electrical energy. But the chemical energy that, again, we're focusing on and that the cells use to store energy or to get the energy that they need. For example, a heterotroph is going to get its energy in adenosine triphosphate, which is what we abbreviate as ATP. At the bottom of this slide, you can see there's a video on ATP. It's only about 8 minutes, I believe. So watch that. It'll give you a lot more energy on a lot more energy, a lot more information on ATP that you can watch on your own time. Basically, ATP has this structure here, and this should look familiar. So see what this reminds you of. It has adenine, which is a nitrogenous base. It has ribose, which is a 5-carbon sugar. And then it has 3 phosphate groups. So if we took away 2 of those phosphate groups here, these 2, what you should recognize is we have the typical nucleic acid. So ATP is a type of nucleic acid, actually, but we never think of it in those terms. We don't think of it as part of our DNA, and because it's not. It's strictly an energy storage molecule in the body. ADP is when we only have 2 phosphates attached instead of the 3. So you can see here in this diagram down below how if we take off one of those phosphate groups that are attached, one of those blue circles, then we have ADP. So a cell can store small amounts of energy by adding that 3rd phosphate group to ADP. Because when you have ADP, you only have a partially charged battery. But if you put in some energy to the system, then we can add that phosphate to the end to make ATP. And at that point, that's a fully charged battery. The picture up here in the top right is actually a more realistic picture of what ATP looks like. And you can see here is our sugar. This is our sugar molecule. Here we have our 3 phosphates here, and then here's our nitrogenous base. In order to get the energy out of ATP, what has to happen is breaking apart this bond right here. You can think of it, I've seen this actually pictured in a lot of different books or videos that I've seen. In fact, the one that I referenced you to watch back there shows the same thing. That because these phosphate groups are actually a phosphorus with 4 oxygens attached to them, those oxygens that are attached are very electronegative. So they generally tend to have a negative charge to them. Because oxygen, as you'll remember when we talked about water, is always trying to attract electrons, so it does a good job of that. But when you put a lot of charges that are similar, so if you have a negative charge next to a negative charge, they repel each other. And then if we pile on a third one, there's also a repelling going on between this one and this one and this one and that one. So if you think of it, you put a minus sign above each of these phosphates. Think of it as magnets that are repelling and pushing against each other. And so it's that strain that's put on these bonds that actually helps to make this such a good energy storage molecule. You think of it basically as springs that are tightly wound, holding these bonds together, so holding these molecules together. And then when we're able to actually break that bond, we get a big release of energy. So, and that's what the cells use to do all of their functions. Any cellular activity, like active transport that we talked about before, going across the cell membrane, when you're trying to move something from its low concentration into a high concentration, so going in the opposite of a normal diffusion direction, we need energy to do that. And so ATP, when we break off that third phosphate group, gives the energy that's needed to move something across the cell membrane. We also use ATP when proteins are being synthesized, so when we're making protein, or even the simple things like anytime you move a muscle, there is that breaking of that phosphate bond of an ATP molecule that allows your muscle to move, even if it's simply picking up your pencil or pen to write notes right now. So ATP has these characteristics. Its structure makes it an exceptionally good energy source for all cells. Most cells, though, only have a small amount of ATP because of the spring and the repulsion between those phosphate groups. It's not a really stable molecule, so it's not a good way to store a large amount of energy. So cells have to make the ATP that they're going to use pretty close to when they're using it. There's not a lot of ATP being stored in your cells at any one time. So what cells have to do is they use an ATP and it becomes ADP, and ADP is a little bit easier to keep floating around in your cells. And then when the cell needs energy, then it has to convert this ADP back into ATP. And the way it does that, we're going to study in the next chapter, is through cellular respiration. And that's the process of breaking down glucose molecules in order to make ATP from ADP. Okay, so that's the end of section 1. Here are a couple quick questions to help you make sure you understand what you just heard about. So see if you can answer this first one. Okay, so you should know that that's an autotroph. You should know that autotrophs mostly get their energy from the sun. How is energy released from ATP? You should know a phosphate group is removed. The way that most cells are able to function with only a small amount of ATP. Think about which answer would be best here. The only good answer here is B. ATP can be quickly regenerated. That word means that we recycle basically an ADP with a phosphate. It's called an inorganic phosphate that gets added to make new ATP. So compared to the energy stored in a molecule of glucose, ATP stores much less energy. And we're going to look at and see why that makes sense. The reason, when we're studying cellular respiration, this will make more sense. But when we break apart a glucose molecule, we're actually breaking a lot more bonds. If you think of the formula for glucose, it's C6H12O6. So there are a lot of bonds there that are going to be broken that are able to release energy. And when we break apart a glucose molecule, we're actually able to make between 32 and 36 ATPs. So that's how much less energy actually is found in an ATP molecule versus a glucose. Okay, so we're going to go on to section 2 in just a second. So this is 8.2, and this is going to go over photosynthesis. So the key cellular process that produces energy is photosynthesis. And it's that process in which green plants are going to use the energy of sunlight to convert water and carbon dioxide into a high energy carbohydrate and oxygen. And you can see here with this picture, here's our sunlight going in, water entering here. This also is an entering molecule. This is our carbon dioxide. And then the things that come out are our high energy carbohydrate like glucose and oxygen. And you can see here with this picture that photosynthesis is divided into two separate parts. There's the light-dependent reaction, and of course that's the one that is dealing with the sunlight. And then we have what used to be called the light-independent reaction, but now we simply call it the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is the second part of photosynthesis that actually makes the sugar, and that's where we use the carbon dioxide to make the sugar. And here we can see the process of producing ATP in the light-dependent reaction, and then that ATP's energy is used in the Calvin cycle to make glucose, and in the process we take off that phosphate group and end up with an ADP that is then ready to go back to the light-dependent reaction to be made into ATP again. The other molecule involved in photosynthesis in terms of carrying energy from the light-dependent reaction to the Calvin cycle is NADPH, and this is called an electron carrier. NADPH is a molecule that will take the energy that the chloroplast gets from the sun and carry that energy over to the Calvin cycle so that the plant cell, can make a glucose molecule in the Calvin cycle. There are some experiments performed by Van Helmont, Priestley, and Ingelhaus that led to work by other scientists who finally discovered that in the presence of light, plants were able to take carbon dioxide and water and make it into carbohydrates. But the other thing that they did was they released oxygen. So look in your textbook, these three scientists and their studies and what each one contributed. This is a review of the equation for photosynthesis. So if we just write out this equation, we see that we have carbon dioxide needs to be added, water needs to be added along with light, and then what we get out is our high energy sugar, our glucose molecule, and we get oxygen out. So another way to look at this is in this diagram. So we have the addition of light energy coming from the sun, and the sun sends that energy in the form of photons. Photons are just particles of light energy. And that light energy goes into those light-dependent reactions. Those light-dependent reactions, if you think back to the diagram I showed you before, are located in the thylakoids. So the thylakoid is a part of a chloroplast. The chloroplast is, hopefully you guys are familiar with this from this week's work, but the chloroplast is made up of a thylakoid region, which are stacked like pancakes to make what are called granum. And in those granum are floating around